For over 6 decades, a perfect and silent economic extraction machine has been draining the wealth of a supposedly independent nation. Since 1960, the gold beneath the soil, the cotton in the fields, and the labor of the people have flowed out of the borders, leaving nothing behind but a crushing cycle of debt and engineered poverty. Burkina Faso was given a flag, a national anthem, and a seat at the United Nations, but the actual remote control to its economy remained firmly locked in foreign capitals. This was the blueprint of modern economic subjugation. That is, until a young soldier operating a broke and besieged country, fighting a war on multiple fronts, decided to shatter the mechanism entirely. He did not do it with sweeping diplomatic rhetoric or by appealing to international financial institutions. He did it by completely rewriting the financial DNA of a nation, executing a series of calculated economic strikes that 6 decades of elected governments never dared to attempt. Most leaders sitting in peaceful, wealthy nations with none of Burkina Faso's security crises would hesitate to make these decisions. Yet, this administration moved forward, breaking a century-old business model that relied on keeping Africa perpetually at the bottom of the global supply chain. To understand the magnitude of what is happening, you have to understand the trap. The system was brilliantly simple in its cruelty. A nation like Burkina Faso grows raw cotton, harvests it through intense manual labor, and ships it out of the country in its rawest, cheapest form. That raw material crosses oceans, lands in foreign industrial zones, gets spun, dyed, tailored, and branded. Then, that exact same cotton is shipped back to Burkina Faso as a finished shirt sold at 10 times the original price. The value addition, the massive profit margins, and the industrial jobs are all kept safely outside of Africa. When the country inevitably runs a trade deficit because it is buying back its own resources at inflated prices, it is forced to borrow money from the very institutions that benefit from the system. It is a closed loop of financial dependency. Breaking a system this entrenched requires more than just policy papers. It requires preparing a population for severe economic shockwaves. The foundation of this geopolitical pivot was not a military strategy, but an extreme display of financial austerity at the very top. Ibrahim Traoré realized that to ask a nation to endure the pain of economic transition, he had to weaponize trust. He started by slashing his own presidential salary to roughly $3,000 a year. Let that number sink in. While the leadership in Kenya officially draws near $192,000 annually, and South Africa's executive branch commands over $220,000. The man restructuring Burkina Faso earns less in 12 months than some of his regional peers make in a single week. He refused the luxury of a presidential palace, choosing instead to sleep in a military barracks. He ordered a mandatory 30% pay cut for all government ministers. But he did not just cut at the top. He simultaneously authorized a 50% wage increase for standard civil servants, directly shifting state resources to the working class. Even the visual aesthetics of state authority were stripped of their colonial legacy. The European-style wigs and heavy gowns worn by the judiciary, a lingering visual reminder of foreign rule, were abolished and replaced with traditional Burkinabe woven garments. From a purely macroeconomic standpoint, none of these symbolic gestures built a single factory. None of them paved a road, refined an ounce of gold, or balanced a national budget. But they engineered something infinitely more valuable in a time of crisis: absolute national consensus. When a leader who sleeps on a military cot and makes $3,000 a year tells a nation that they are going into an economic war to reclaim their sovereign wealth, the people believe him. By taking the financial hit first, the administration inoculated itself against accusations of corruption and built the political capital necessary to ask the population for massive sacrifices. You cannot ask your citizens to endure the turbulent restructuring of a national economy if you are insulated from the consequences in a gilded palace. This foundational trust was the prerequisite for the real operation. With the population unified and the old aesthetics of subservience burned away, Burkina Faso prepared to strike at the very heart of the foreign-controlled extraction economy. With the foundation of public trust solidified through extreme austerity at the top, the administration was positioned to execute the most aggressive phase of its economic restructuring. The primary target was the historical epicenter of African wealth extraction, the mining sector. For decades, the standard operating procedure across the continent involved multinational corporations securing extraction rights for a fraction of the mineral's actual market value. The newly formed government immediately moved to bring 94 tons of gold under direct state control, anchoring roughly $6 billion directly into the national treasury. They did not stop at mere regulation. 5 major gold mines were subjected to immediate nationalization. Furthermore, a sweeping new mining code was implemented, mandating that the state hold a minimum 30% stake in every future extraction project. When you consider that neighboring countries have historically operated under mining laws that cement state ownership at a stagnant and suffocating 10%, this move effectively tripled the nation's share of its own geological wealth overnight. It was a direct declaration that the era of foreign entities treating the Sahel as an endless, low-cost quarry was over. But securing gold is only half the battle. Gold provides capital reserves, but true economic resilience requires industrial sovereignty. The most insidious component of the 60-year economic trap was the systematic prevention of local manufacturing. A country can never build a stable middle class if it is restricted to exporting dirt and raw fibers. To dismantle this, the government initiated a rapid domestic industrialization campaign, targeting the very agricultural resources that had historically enriched overseas factories. They nationalized Sofitex, one of the nation's largest cotton companies, ensuring that the raw material would feed local supply chains rather than foreign textile mills. A second massive cotton processing plant was established, alongside a new national dairy factory and a large-scale tomato processing facility. The economic logic is absolute. Force the value-added processes to occur entirely on Burkinabe soil. By manufacturing the finished product domestically, the nation captures the profit margins, creates thousands of industrial jobs, and stops hemorrhaging foreign currency to import basic goods made from its own harvested materials. This industrial shift acts as a defensive shield against the most dangerous weapon deployed against developing nations in the modern era: sovereign debt. To understand the sheer audacity of Burkina Faso's financial strategy, one must look at the cautionary tales surrounding it. In 2020, Zambia defaulted, watching its debt eclipse 100% of its gross domestic product, leading to years of agonizing international negotiations just to restructure what it owed. By 2022, Ghana faced a similar crisis, defaulting on $30 billion and undergoing severe economic contraction. Sovereign debt is rarely just a financial obligation. It is a profound mechanism of control. When a nation owes billions to international financial institutions, those institutions dictate domestic policy. They force the removal of agricultural subsidies, mandate the privatization of state assets, and prioritize debt servicing over civilian infrastructure. Burkina Faso's leadership understood that borrowing from these traditional mechanisms meant surrendering the very sovereignty they were fighting a war to reclaim. To bypass this international debt machinery, the administration unveiled a staggering $64 billion national development plan. The revolutionary aspect of this blueprint is not the monetary figure, but its funding structure. 2/3 of this massive economic overhaul is engineered to be financed entirely from domestic sources, bypassing foreign lenders and structural adjustment programs. They facilitated this through the creation of a new independent national bank, designed specifically to pool local capital and redirect it into national infrastructure. Through this internal financial ecosystem, the state managed to clear nearly $4.7 billion of local debt. This is a critical maneuver. Paying off internal debt means local contractors, businesses, and workers finally receive their money, injecting massive liquidity directly into the domestic economy instead of wiring interest payments to offshore accounts. By paying themselves first, the administration effectively insulated the country from external creditors who historically weaponized debt to extract political concessions, proving that financial self-reliance is the ultimate defense strategy. Numbers on a national ledger, no matter how vast or unprecedented, can often feel distant and abstract. To truly grasp the magnitude of crushing a 60-year economic trap, we must look away from the nationalized gold vaults in the capital and travel to the sun-scorched agricultural belts outside of Bobo Dioulasso. The macroeconomic war being waged at the highest levels of government only matters if it alters the reality of the people on the ground. Here, in the sprawling cotton fields, we find a story that mirrors millions of others across the Sahel. Let us consider a man named Issa. He is a third-generation farmer for his entire life, and the lives of his father and grandfather before him. The daily rhythm of existence was dictated by a deeply unbalanced and exploitative global equation. Under the old economic model, Issa's family would spend months engaged in grueling, back-breaking manual labor under a relentless sun to harvest premium raw cotton. Once harvested, this white gold was handed over to foreign-managed export conglomerates at a price artificially suppressed by distant commodity markets, markets in which Issa had absolutely no voice. Year after year, he watched his harvest loaded onto heavy trucks, driven across borders to coastal ports, and shipped away to industrialized zones on other continents. Months later, those exact same cotton fibers would return to the local markets of West Africa, transformed into mass-produced shirts, trousers, and textiles, carrying a price tag 10 times higher than what Issa was paid for the raw material. He was trapped in an invisible cage of the modern extraction economy, a system perfectly designed to demand his physical labor while systematically denying him the generational wealth that labor generated. Despite working one of the most resource-rich soils on the continent, Issa's family remained anchored in poverty. They lacked basic mechanized farming equipment, remained entirely vulnerable to the unpredictable cycles of rainfall, and perpetually hovered on the terrifying edge of food insecurity. It was an engineered paradox. The people feeding the global supply chain could barely afford to feed themselves. Then, the aggressive economic shock waves engineered by the new administration finally reached the soil of Bobo Dioulasso. When the government made the historic decision to nationalize major agricultural entities like the Sofitex Cotton Company and aggressively directed its internal development funds toward domestic capabilities, Issa's world underwent a seismic transformation. The state ceased to be a distant passive entity merely collecting taxes and facilitating foreign exports. It transformed into an active, invested partner in local production. For the first time in his family's history, Issa did not have to rely entirely on hand tools and physical endurance. Through the internally financed agricultural initiatives, his local farming cooperative received a state-procured motorized water pump and gained access to heavily subsidized fertilizers. Even more revolutionary, a fleet of new tractors arrived in his district, part of a massive national deployment of over 400 tractors and 700 pumps aimed directly at the working class. Before this moment, farmers in his region had only seen heavy machinery driving past their fields, usually owned by massive foreign agribusinesses. With this targeted industrial support, Issa's crop yields multiplied. But the most profound change was not the volume of his harvest, it was its destination. Issa's cotton is no longer packed onto ships bound for overseas textile mills. It travels just a few miles down the road to newly expanded, domestically controlled processing plants. The critical value addition, the spinning, the weaving, the manufacturing, is finally happening on Burkinabe soil. This localization changes the entire generational trajectory of his family. Issa's eldest daughter is no longer destined to repeat the cycle of picking raw cotton in the fields for pennies. Because the manufacturing sector is now domestic, she has secured a technical position inside the newly constructed textile factory, earning a steady, formalized wage. Her labor is building the domestic economy, not subsidizing a foreign one. This single family's transition is the living, breathing embodiment of the state's broader strategic vision. The administration applied this exact same aggressive localization to essential food production, distributing vegetable seeds, fish feed, and irrigation networks to producers who had historically been ignored. This is the precise mechanism by which a nation manages to achieve unprecedented food self-sufficiency in the middle of a severe, multifaceted security crisis. The leadership understood a fundamental truth of geopolitical survival. A country cannot fight a war for absolute sovereignty if it still relies on foreign cargo ships to feed its own citizens. By aiming to drive the national poverty rate down from 42% to 35% by the year 2030 and pushing life expectancy upward, the government is proving that agriculture is not a charity sector. In this new era of self-reliance, a well-equipped farmer operating within a localized industrial supply chain is the ultimate instrument of national defense, producing your own food, processing your own resources, and employing your own people is the most impenetrable insurance policy a sovereign nation can build. The narrative of total economic liberation is exhilarating, but executing it on the global stage invites a severe and calculated blowback. When a developing nation unilaterally rewrites the rules of resource extraction, the international financial architecture does not simply surrender. It retaliates, seizing a 30% minimum stake in mining operations and nationalizing massive agricultural conglomerates, triggers immediate hostility from multinational corporations that have enjoyed decades of uninterrupted dominance. To understand the immense risk Burkina Faso has taken, one only needs to look across its borders at its regional allies within the Sahel. In neighboring Mali, similar moves to assert sovereign control over mineral wealth resulted in aggressive international pushback and high-stakes legal confrontations. Massive global entities like Barrick Gold found themselves in tense standoffs with the state, while Resolute Mining faced intense scrutiny that ultimately resulted in executives being detained and a massive financial settlement of over $160 million just to resolve the dispute. Burkina Faso is walking this exact same treacherous tightrope. Forging a path of economic defiance naturally scares off traditional foreign direct investment. The global capital markets punish nations that refuse to play by the established rules, threatening to choke off liquidity, initiate international arbitration lawsuits, and isolate the country from global trade networks. This is the brutal, unavoidable reality of reclaiming sovereignty. It is extraordinarily expensive in the short term, and the transitional phase is fraught with economic turbulence. To counter this Western economic and military isolation, the administration in Ouagadougou executed a hard geopolitical pivot. They expelled French military forces, severing the most visible remaining ties of the colonial era, and rapidly diversified their strategic partnerships. Military and nuclear energy discussions were opened with Russia, bringing a new heavyweight into the regional security dynamic, while China was brought in to develop massive infrastructure projects, including a cement plant capable of producing 750,000 tons annually. But this rapid pivot raises a critical, uncomfortable question for Pan-African strategists and geopolitical analysts alike. Is this genuine liberation, or is it simply trading a European landlord for an Eastern one? The danger of the 60-year economic trap is that it is highly adaptable. It can easily be repainted in new colors and presented as bilateral cooperation. True independence is not defined by which foreign superpower a nation chooses to align with. It is defined entirely by leverage. A nation is only truly sovereign if it possesses the capacity to walk away from any negotiating table at any time without its domestic economy collapsing. By heavily focusing on internal industrial capacity, local funding mechanisms, and food security, Burkina Faso is attempting to ensure that its new international partnerships are based on transactional mutual interest rather than structural dependency. Yet, the most profound threat to this entire economic revolution does not come from Paris, Washington, Moscow, or Beijing. It comes from the fragility of history. In the 1980s, within these exact same borders, a visionary leader named Thomas Sankara attempted an almost identical blueprint. He slashed government salaries, rejected foreign aid, promoted domestic industry, and renamed the country Burkina Faso, the land of upright men. But Sankarà's revolution was deeply tied to his personal charisma, his individual authority, and his sheer force of will. When he was assassinated in a military coup, the entire apparatus of self-reliance died with him. Within a few short years, the nation was dragged right back into the very economic trap he had sacrificed his life to escape. This historical tragedy is the shadow hanging over Ibrahim Traoré. Good policy tied to a single mortal man is not a sustainable system. It is a ticking countdown clock. The ultimate test for this current administration is not whether they can nationalize a gold mine today or build a cotton factory tomorrow. The true test is whether they can build legal and structural firewalls that protect those assets regardless of who is in power a decade from now. The survival of this economic rebellion depends entirely on institutionalizing the revolution. These sweeping changes must be permanently embedded into constitutional law, secured through impenetrable state contracts, and defended by a judiciary and civil service that operate independently of the military barracks. Only by transforming these emergency decrees into permanent, self-sustaining state institutions can Burkina Faso guarantee that its wealth will never again be exported to the highest foreign bidder. The events unfolding in Burkina Faso extend far beyond the borders of a single landlocked nation in the Sahel. What Ibrahim Traoré and his administration are writing in real time is a brutal, uncompromising, and highly effective manual for absolute economic liberation. This is not a theoretical academic paper. It is a battle-tested blueprint built on 5 unforgiving principles that the rest of the developing world is watching closely. First, a nation must unequivocally refuse to let a single ounce of raw material cross its borders until it has extracted the maximum possible value through local refinement. Second, a sovereign state must weaponize its internal capital, funding its own infrastructure and paying its own people before it ever considers signing a suffocating international debt agreement. Third, a country must aggressively seize a dominant share of the natural resources being pulled from its own earth, recognizing that foreign capital is a tool to be managed, not a master to be served. Fourth, national security must be redefined to start in the soil. You must feed your people first, because a nation that relies on foreign cargo ships for its daily bread has already surrendered its independence. And finally, the most difficult lesson of all, a true revolution cannot operate as a shrine to a single charismatic leader. It must be rapidly transformed into a self-sustaining system of laws and institutions that outlive the individuals who created them. These 5 pillars represent a tectonic fracture in the post-colonial global order. For over 60 years, the prevailing international narrative insisted that the African continent was fundamentally incapable of industrial modernization without the heavy-handed stewardship of Western financial institutions. The 60-year trap was designed to make these nations believe that their only role in the global economy was to act as perpetual debtors and cheap resource quarries. Burkina Faso, a nation currently navigating a severe internal security crisis, is systematically destroying that myth by nationalizing supply chains, redirecting domestic funds, and forcing the localization of industry. They are proving that the chains of economic subjugation are completely voluntary. Once a nation decides to stop participating in its own exploitation, The entire extractive machine grinds to a halt. The blueprint for financial sovereignty is now out in the open. The template has been proven. The only remaining question is which nation will have the political courage to execute it next. You will not find this level of structural defiance accurately analyzed on traditional mainstream financial networks. The global media apparatus is heavily incentivized to portray the Sahel strictly as a region of endless, chaotic instability, conveniently ignoring the fact that it is rapidly becoming a laboratory for radical economic sovereignty. They do not want to discuss the mechanics of how a developing nation actually escapes the debt trap. That is exactly why this platform exists. If you are committed to understanding the real geopolitical maneuvers shaping the future of the global South, and if you believe in decoding the financial strategies that are actively shifting the balance of power back to the African continent, then make sure you are subscribed to this channel. We are building a global diaspora of critical thinkers who refuse to accept the surface level narratives handed down by the old empires. Hit the notification bell so you are always the first to know when we decode the policies and power plays the establishment prefers to keep quiet. The global extraction machine has operated unopposed for generations, projecting an illusion of invincibility. But as the world is witnessing right now in the heart of West Africa, no system of exploitation can survive a nation that has finally decided to stand up and reclaim its worth. Thank you for lending your time, your attention, and your sharp intellect to this necessary conversation. Until we meet again to break down the next major geopolitical shift, stay informed, stay deeply resilient, and peace be with you.